C1, the boss who controls billions, couldn't find $100,000 to save his dying daughter. But his wife made one secret call, and another man sent $100 billion overnight. The truth behind that call would change everything. In a quiet hospital corridor in Seoul, Kang Si-won stood frozen for the first time in his life. A man who had never lost control now couldn't move a single dollar. Every account locked. Every connection is useless. And just down the hall, his 8-year-old daughter had only 48 hours to live. But while Si-won fought a system that refused to answer him, his wife, Choi Ara, had already stepped away, dialing a number he didn't even know still existed. By morning, the impossible happened. The money came, the surgery was approved, but the question remained: who really saved his daughter, and what did it cost him? He did not think of himself as a criminal. He thought of himself as a man who understood how things actually worked, as opposed to how they were supposed to. There was always a gap between those two things. Si-won lived in that gap. He had built everything he owned inside it. Money was his primary language and his primary tool. Not for luxury, though the penthouse apartment in Hanam-dong and the Italian suits were consequences of it, but for leverage. Money meant options. Options meant control. Control meant that no situation, no person, and no outcome could surprise him in a way he hadn't already prepared for. He had bought silence, he had bought loyalty, he had bought time, access, verdicts, and on 2 occasions that Junho was never permitted to discuss, he had bought the kind of outcomes that kept certain powerful men in their positions and certain dangerous men out of his way. In 38 years, Kang Si-won had never been told no by anything he could pay for. He had never had to be afraid of a number. And then one Tuesday morning in October, a doctor named Park Min-jae walked into a consultation room at Seoul National University Hospital, sat down across from Si-won and his wife, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. On it, a diagnosis, a timeline, a cost. Si-won looked at the number. He reached for his phone, and for the first time in his life, nothing moved. Kang Hae-in was 8 years old, and she was the only person in Seoul who could make her father laugh without trying. Not the controlled, measured smile Si-won deployed in boardrooms, not the cold amusement he allowed himself when a negotiation landed perfectly. A real laugh, unguarded, arriving without permission, the kind that briefly made him look like someone who had never built an empire on fear. She produced it regularly, without effort, simply by existing in the particular way she did. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she deployed both simultaneously in a way that made argument impossible. She collected things: smooth stones from the Han River walkway, pressed leaves arranged by color in a notebook she kept under her pillow, small ceramic animals lined along her windowsill in an order only she understood. When Si-won came home late, which was most nights, he would sometimes stand in the doorway of her room and watch her sleep, her small collection visible in the dark, and feel something he had no professional language for. She had seemed tired for weeks. That was all. Tired and pale. The kind of pale that Choi Ara had mentioned twice to Si-won and that Si-won had filed under the category of things that doctors were for. An appointment was made, then a second appointment. Then, with the speed that felt like the floor dropping away, a specialist. Then, Park Min-jae. Dr. Park Min-jae was 44, precise, and not the kind of man who softened information. He placed the sheet on the table and explained it without ornamentation. Acute aplastic anemia, severe classification. The bone marrow had stopped producing. The condition was aggressive and would not stabilize without intervention. A matched donor transplant was required. The window was narrow, 72 hours before her blood counts would decline to a level that made surgery significantly more dangerous. The cost of the procedure, the donor coordination, and the required post-operative NICU care was $100,000. Siwon heard the number the way he heard all numbers, as a variable to be managed. He was already reaching for his phone before Park Min-jae finished the sentence. He had 3 accounts that existed precisely for moments like this: liquid, accessible, requiring a single authorization. He pulled up the first. Access denied. He moved to the second, a separate institution, a channel he had used 6 weeks ago without issue. Access denied. He kept his face still. That was training. He felt the first cold thread of something unfamiliar move through his chest, and he did not acknowledge it. He tried his emergency reserve, an offshore account structured through 4 separate entities specifically to be unreachable by conventional means. The screen returned a single line. Transaction cannot be processed at this time. Siwon set the phone face down on the table. Across from him, Park Min-jae was still talking. Ara's hand had found Hae-in's, and Kang Siwon, for the first time in his life, had nothing to do with his hands at all. Junho knew something was wrong before Siwon said a word. It was the stillness. Siwon was always still, that was not unusual, but this was a different quality of stillness, the kind that preceded not a decision, but a discovery. Junho had worked beside this man for 11 years, and he had learned to read the difference. He was already on his phone by the time Siwon stepped into the corridor outside the consultation room and said, quietly, "Check everything." What Junho found in the next 40 minutes built a picture so precise, so comprehensive, and so perfectly timed that it could only have been architecture. This was not opportunism. Someone had spent months designing this. Every primary account, locked by regulatory freeze, triggered through a compliance flag filed with the Financial Services Commission 3 days ago by an anonymous third party whose paperwork was immaculate. Every secondary holding, similarly flagged, different jurisdictions, same timing. The offshore structures that were supposed to be invisible had been located and reported to 3 separate international bodies simultaneously. Whoever had done this had not simply found the doors. They had mapped every door in the building, waited for the single moment when someone needed to walk through one, and welded them all shut at once. Junho made 19 calls in 40 minutes. He reached the heads of 2 private banks, a senior compliance officer who owed Siwon a debt that had never been called in, and 3 individuals whose specific function in Siwon's network was the resolution of exactly this kind of obstruction. Each call returned the same answer, delivered in varying degrees of apology. Nothing could move. Not today. The mechanisms were legitimate on paper, filings, flags, regulatory holds, and dismantling them through proper channels would take days, weeks, possibly. They did not have days. Siwon stood at the window at the end of the hospital corridor and listened to Junho's report without interrupting. Below, the city moved normally. Traffic on the bridge, lights across the river. Seoul continued its business, indifferent and vast, as it always did. He had built a network specifically designed to make him impossible to isolate. Redundancies upon redundancies, channels that existed off every known ledger. He had been careful in a way that most men in his position were not, because he had understood from the beginning that the point of power was not its display, but its preservation. You did not show your full hand. You did not keep everything in one structure. You built depth. Someone had studied that depth longer and more carefully than he had protected it. He thought about who had the reach, the patience, and the specific motivation to execute something this clean. 2 names surfaced. He set them aside. That problem belonged to another hour. This hour belonged to a room down this corridor where his daughter's blood counts were declining on a schedule that did not care about syndicate wars or regulatory holds or the architectural precision of his enemies. He turned from the window. Junho was already watching him. "There's nothing," Junho said. Not an apology, just the truth. Siwon said nothing. For 11 years, Junho had never seen him without an answer. He still didn't show it, but for the length of one breath, standing in that fluorescent corridor with his empire sealed shut around him, Kang Siwon had none. Choi Ara had been watching her husband for 2 hours. She watched him make calls that went nowhere. She watched Junho's face cycle through controlled urgency to something closer to fear. She watched Siwon stand at corridor window with his back to the room, his shoulders carrying the specific tension of a man who had never needed to ask for help and did not know the shape of the word. She had seen this coming before he had. Not the frozen accounts, not the specific mechanism, but the moment itself. The moment where the thing he had built could not do the one thing that mattered. She had known, in the quiet way she knew most things about her husband, that this moment existed somewhere in their future, that there would come a day when the empire would be insufficient. She had simply not known it would arrive on a Tuesday, in a hospital, with Hyen's name on the diagnosis. She waited until Siwon and Junho moved back toward the consultation room, then she walked in the opposite direction to the stairwell at the end of the corridor and let the door close behind her. The stairwell was empty, fluorescent, cold, the sound of the city absent. She stood on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors and opened her contacts. She scrolled without hesitation. She had never deleted the number. She had told herself across several years that this was simply because deletion felt dramatic. She understood now that was not the reason. She pressed the call. It rang once, twice. Lee Jun-yuk answered on the second ring. What passed between them in the next 4 minutes is not a conversation that belongs to this telling. What matters is what could be seen, if anyone had been watching, in the architecture of Choi Ara's face. She did not cry. She did not lower her voice into apology or raise it into urgency. She stood straight, one hand at her side, and she spoke with the same composure she brought to every room she had ever entered. Every family dinner where Siwon's network sat at the table, and she was the gracious margin. Every public appearance where she was the quiet figure beside the man everyone had actually come to see. Every night she had spent becoming invisible in a marriage that had never once asked her to be visible. The architecture of provision, there was no clean way to hold that. So he held it the only way available to him, in silence, in a crumpled suit, in a waiting room where his money had finally met. But her eyes, if you had been close enough to see them, carried something else, something old. Not grief exactly, and not longing exactly. The specific weight of a chapter you closed before it was finished, pressed flat and carried forward, still legible if held to the light. She said what she needed to say. She listened. She said thank you in a tone that contained more history than the words could hold. Then she ended the call and stood in the stairwell for a moment longer than was necessary. When she pushed back through the door into the corridor, her face was composed. Her hands were steady. 3 hours later, $100 billion moved. The surgery was scheduled for 6 a.m. Dr. Park Min-jae arrived at the hospital at 4:47, reviewed Haein's charts one final time, and spoke briefly with the transplant coordinator who had been working through the night to confirm donor logistics. The funding authorization had cleared every channel by midnight. Clean, complete, without condition. Whatever questions Park Min-jae had about its origin, he set aside. His job was the surgery. Everything else was someone else's architecture. Nurse Han Se-yeon prepped the room. She had been on shift since the previous morning and had declined to hand off when the night rotation arrived, telling the charge nurse simply that she wanted to see this one through. She was 29 and had worked pediatric critical care for 4 years, and she had learned that there were certain patients you stayed for. Haein, who had spent the previous afternoon pressing a small ceramic rabbit into Han Se-yeon's palm and explaining very seriously that it was for good luck, was one of them. Nurse Yoon Ji-soo managed the monitoring station through the procedure, tracking every reading with the focused quiet of someone who understood that the numbers on her screen were not data points, but a life being held in a particular balance. She did not look up for 3 hours. She did not need to. The surgery was taken for 4 hours and 11 minutes. It went without complication. Kang Si-won sat in a waiting room on the third floor in a suit that had cost more than most people's monthly salary and had never in its existence looked as diminished as it did now. The jacket was creased from hours of sitting. The tie was loosened. There was a coffee cup on the chair beside him that Junho had brought at some point and that had gone cold, untouched. He sat with his forearms on his knees and his hands open, which was not a position anyone who knew him would have recognized. Kang Si-won's hands were instruments, signing, directing, building, and closing. He did not know what to do with them when there was nothing to close. He had tried, once more, at 11 p.m. to break the financial freeze through a channel so obscure even Junho hadn't known it existed. It had returned the same answer as all the others. He had put his phone in his jacket pocket and had not taken it out since. He visited every morning. He sat beside her bed and read to her from a book she had selected, a story about a girl who kept a fox in a city apartment and the various complications that followed. Hyein found it funnier than Si-won did. He read it anyway. He read it with the particular focus of a man who needed somewhere specific to put his attention, because the alternative was thinking about what he couldn't stop thinking about. The question had arrived the morning after the surgery and had not left. Where did $100 billion come from in 3 hours? Who moves that kind of capital on a phone call in the middle of the night without paperwork, without negotiation, without conditions? Si-won knew the architecture of large money. He knew what it required and what it meant when those requirements were bypassed. You did not bypass them for a stranger. You did not bypass them for a professional courtesy. You bypassed them for one reason. He did not ask Era. He told himself this was because she was focused on Hyein's recovery and the timing was wrong. He understood, if he was honest, that it was because he was not ready for the answer to be what he suspected. Instead, he did what he always did. He used the network. It took Junho 48 hours to build the full picture. He placed it on Si-won's desk without comment, which was its own kind of commentary. Lee Jun-huk, 39 years old, heir to the Jun-huk Group, legitimate conglomerate, clean record, significant influence across Seoul's financial and cultural institutions, and 11 years ago, before Si-won, before the marriage, before Hyein, Era's person. Not a brief chapter, not a casual history, something serious enough that people who knew them both still remembered it as the relationship that had simply, quietly not been resolved so much as interrupted. What Junho's report made clear, assembled from a dozen careful sources, was this. Jun-huk had not moved on in the way the word applied. He had built a life. He had simply never entirely closed the door that Era had walked through when she left. And Era, the part of the report that Si-won read 3 times, alone, without moving, Era had never asked him to close it. Not because she had been unfaithful, there was nothing in the report to suggest that, and Si-won's network was thorough enough that absence of evidence meant something, but because, across 11 years of marriage to Kang Si-won, she had never been given enough of herself back to make a clean ending feel necessary. Si-won set the report down. Outside his window, Seoul moved through its evening without him. He sat with that for a long time. Before Si-won, Era had a life that belonged entirely to her. She studied art history at Yonsei on a merit scholarship and wrote a thesis on the spatial language of late Joseon court painting that her professor described as the best work he had supervised in a decade. She had wanted to curate, not the decorative kind of curation that wealthy families hired for their lobbies, but the serious kind, the kind that argued something, that placed objects in conversation with each other and trusted the viewer to follow. She had been accepted to a graduate program in Paris. She had a suitcase half-packed. Then she met Kang Si-won at a dinner she had almost declined to attend, and something happened that she had never been able to reduce to a simple explanation. He was not warm, he was not easy, but he looked at her across that table with the full weight of his attention, and she had the distinct and unfamiliar feeling of being seen by someone who did not see most people at all. She unpacked the suitcase, she deferred the program, she told herself it was temporary. That was 11 years ago. The curation career did not happen, not because Siwon had forbidden it. He had never forbidden anything, which was its own kind of erasure. It simply never became a priority in the architecture of their life together. There was always something more pressing. The network required a certain kind of wife, present at certain dinners, fluent in a certain register of gracious invisibility. Era learned it the way she learned everything, thoroughly and without complaint. She attended the dinners, she wore the right things, she became, gradually and almost without noticing, the margin of a page whose center was always someone else's text. Junhuk had known her before. That was the simplest way to say it. He had known her when she still argued about paintings at midnight and kept gallery brochures in her coat pockets and had opinions she expressed without first calculating their effect on a room. He had loved that version of her with a straightforwardness that she had found almost suspicious at the time, because she had not yet learned that straightforward love was the rarest kind.
She had not called him because she still loved him the way she once had. She understood that. The heart keeps cleaner accounts than people credit it with. She had called him because he was the only person she knew with absolute certainty would hear her voice and respond to it as though it mattered. Not as Siwon's wife, not as Haeun's mother, not as the gracious margin of someone else's empire, as Choi Ara, whose daughter was dying, who needed help, who was asking. He had not hesitated. He had not made her explain herself 3 times or perform distress to earn the response. He had simply said, quietly, "Tell me what she needs." 4 words. 11 years of marriage had not once offered her their equivalent. That was not Junhuk's virtue. That was Siwon's absence, made visible at last by the contrast. He asked her on a Thursday evening, 10 days after the surgery. Haeun was asleep, the apartment was quiet in the way that only becomes possible once a crisis has passed, and the silence stops feeling like a warning. Ara was in the kitchen, her hands around a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, looking out at the city through the window above the sink. Siwon came in and sat down at the table. He did not pour himself anything. He placed both hands flat on the surface and said, without preamble, "Tell me about Junhuk." Ara did not turn from the window immediately. She took one measured breath. Then she turned and sat down across from him and looked at him with an expression that was not anger and not grief, but something more deliberate than either. The expression of a person who has been waiting for a question for a long time and has decided, now that it has finally arrived, to answer it completely. She told him the truth, not the version designed to wound and not the version designed to reassure, the plain one. She told him that she had called Junhuk because he answered, not just on that night in the general sense, that he had always been a person who answered when she spoke, who registered her presence as a presence rather than a fixture, who had known her as someone with a specific interior life and had remained curious about it. She told Siwon that she was not saying this to punish him. She was saying it because he had asked, and she was done with the particular exhaustion of shaping her truths into shapes that wouldn't inconvenience him. Siwon said nothing. His hands were still flat on the table. She told him what the last 11 years had actually looked like from inside them, not the version in which she was the gracious and capable wife of a powerful man, which was the version that existed in every room they had ever shared publicly. The interior version. The dinners where she had spoken and watched his attention drift to the next transaction before she finished her sentence. The evenings he arrived home at midnight and narrated his day as though hers had been a waiting room. The slow and undramatic process by which she had stopped sharing things with him, not in one decision, but in 100 small withdrawals, each one a response to a door that had been left slightly less open than before. "You built an empire," she said, "and forgot there was a person living inside it with you." The sentence landed without drama. She had not raised her voice for any of it. That was the thing about Choi Ara. She did not need volume. She had always been precise. Siwon had simply never been the subject of it before. He sat with it. He did not deflect or qualify or reach for the language of counter-negotiation that had served him in every difficult conversation of his adult life. There was no counter-offer available. She had not made an accusation. She had read him a record, and every line of it was accurate. Siwon requested the meeting. That detail mattered. He had spent 2 days after the conversation with Ara doing something he had no practiced method for, sitting with information he could not act on. He could not undo 11 years. He could not retroactively populate the dinners where his attention had drifted, or recover the sentences she had stopped finishing. He could not unfreeze his accounts or unsave his daughter through his own means. The things that needed doing had already been done, and none of them had been done by him. What he could do was face the man who had done them. He called Junhuk's office directly, through legitimate channels using his own name, no intermediaries, no network pressure, no implication of leverage. He asked for 30 minutes. Junhuk's assistant called back within the hour and confirmed the time.
They met at a quiet restaurant in Jongno that belonged to neither of their worlds. Not Siwon's shadow geography, nor Junyuk's corporate circuit. A neutral table. Two men who had never previously occupied the same room, sitting across from each other in the mid-morning quiet while the staff prepared for lunch service around them. Junyuk was composed in the way that people are when they have already decided what they will and will not say. He was not hostile. He was not warm. He looked at Siwon with a directness that was not a challenge, but simply the baseline register of a man who had nothing to perform. Siwon had prepared for several versions of this conversation. He had prepared for grievance, for veiled threat, for the particular smugness of a man who believes he has won something. None of those versions arrived. He told Junyuk he wanted to return the funds. He had restructured 3 holdings in the past week, the financial freeze was beginning to fracture along its edges, and he had located sufficient liquidity to cover the full transfer. He named the amount, he named the account. He asked Junyuk to confirm receipt terms. Junyuk listened. Then he said that he would accept the transfer and named a children's medical foundation as the destination rather than any personal account. The gesture was not theatrical, it was simply what he preferred. Then he looked at Siwon and said the thing he had come to say. He had not done it for Siwon. He wanted that understood, not as an insult, but as a clarification. He had done it because Ara had asked, and in all the years he had known her, she had never asked for anything she had not genuinely needed and fully deserved. That was the entirety of his reasoning. There was no claim in it, no expectation, no door being held open. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He said one more thing, quietly, without looking back. She spent a long time making herself smaller than she is. I hope you've noticed. Then he left. Siwon sat at the table alone and understood that he had just met not his rival, but his mirror, a reflection of everything Ara had needed that had been available to her from someone else because it had never been offered by him. The restaurant filled slowly around him. He did not move for a long time. Hae-in had been moved to a recovery room on the 5th floor, smaller and quieter than the critical ward, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made the space feel less institutional than it actually was. She was getting stronger in the incremental, unglamorous way that real recovery works, not a steady climb, but an uneven one. Good hours and harder hours, appetite returning in small negotiations. She had asked for her stone collection to be brought from home. It now occupied the narrow windowsill in the specific order only she understood, and she had explained the order to Siwon one afternoon with great seriousness while he sat beside her and listened with the full weight of his attention, which was the most valuable thing he possessed, and the thing he had most consistently misdirected. He came every day, Ara came every day. They had not discussed this arrangement, it had simply become true, the way certain things become true in the aftermath of crises, not decided, but arrived at, like furniture rearranged by a flood. On a Saturday afternoon in late October, Heian fell asleep mid-conversation, which she did sometimes without warning, her body still reclaiming rest it was owed. The room settled into the particular quiet of a sleeping child. Monitor rhythms, the distant sound of the ward beyond the door, weak afternoon light crossing the floor. Siwan sat on one side of the bed, Ara sat on the other. Between them, Heian breathed. They did not speak for a long time. There was no performance of ease between them, and no performance of difficulty either. Just two people in a room with the wreckage and the beginning of something else occupying the same space simultaneously, the way those things do when there is no clean line between them. Then Heian, without waking, shifted slightly and reached out both hands in the reflexive, unself-conscious way that sleeping children do. Her left hand found Ara's, her right hand found Siwan's. She held them with the loose, complete trust of someone who does not know there is anything to hold together, because in her understanding, there never was.
Siwan looked up. Ara was already looking at him. She did not look away. He said it without rehearsal, which was the only reason it landed the way it did. Not a negotiation, and not an apology, and not one of the managed, strategic sentences he had built his life from. Just the true thing, spoken plainly into the quiet room. I didn't know how to need you. I'm going to learn. Ara looked at him for a long moment. She did not say it was enough. It wasn't, and she was not a person who said things that weren't true to fill silence. But she did not let go of his hand. Outside the window, the city continued. Inside the room, the monitors kept their rhythm. Heian breathed between them, her small hands holding what her parents had not yet figured out how to hold themselves. And in that quiet, blue light, the smell of antiseptic and morning, their daughter's steady breath, something that had been contracting for years, opened. Slightly, with no guarantee of what came next. It was not a resolution, it was a direction. For the first time in a long time, that was enough to move toward. Tell me what you understand and learn from this story. Tell me your moral lesson and advice to others.